The cruelest goodbyes are the quiet ones, because by the time you hear the silence, it's already too late. The dinner rush had already begun when Ethan Cole noticed something strange about table 7. His espresso was late. Not by much. Maybe 2 minutes. But in a restaurant like Maison Belmont, where every crystal glass reflected precision and every waiter moved like part of an expensive symphony, 2 minutes felt wrong. Ethan glanced at his Swiss watch, irritation tightening his jaw as soft jazz drifted beneath the golden chandeliers overhead. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath cold November rain. Inside, wealthy couples laughed over red wine while investors discussed mergers and voices polished by money and old confidence. But Ethan barely heard any of it. Because for the first time in almost 2 years, his coffee had arrived with 2 sugar packets instead of 1. He stared at the cup for a moment, then slowly looked up. A young server he didn't recognize stood beside the table, nervous fingers gripping a silver tray. "Is something wrong, sir?" she asked carefully. Ethan's eyes drifted back to the espresso. "I take 1 sugar." "I'm sorry, sir. Clara usually handles your table." The name landed strangely in his chest. Clara. Ethan looked around instinctively, expecting to see her weaving calmly between tables the way she always did. Blonde hair tied neatly behind her neck. White shirt sleeves rolled carefully to her wrists. That soft expression that somehow made people lower their voices around her without realizing why. But tonight, she wasn't there. The restaurant suddenly felt unfamiliar. Louder. Colder. Ethan leaned back slowly. "Where is she?" The waitress hesitated. "Just for a second." "She left, Mr. Cole." He frowned. "Left for the night." The girl swallowed gently. "No, sir. She quit." Somewhere across the room, silverware clinked against porcelain. A woman laughed too loudly near the bar. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. But Ethan heard none of it. Because for reasons he couldn't explain, the words didn't make sense in his mind. Clara quit. No, that wasn't possible. Clara was always there. Every night at exactly 8:15, before Ethan even sat down, his espresso would already be waiting. On difficult evenings, there would be aspirin beside the saucer without him asking. On colder nights, she switched the ceramic cups because she once overheard him mention they kept the coffee warm longer. Tiny things. Invisible things. The kind people never notice until they disappear. Ethan looked down at the espresso again. 2 sugars. Wrong cup. No aspirin. Empty space where quiet understanding used to exist. "Mr. Cole," the young waitress asked carefully, "would you like me to remake it?" Ethan stared at the untouched coffee for several seconds before answering. No, his voice came out lower than intended. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. And somehow, that bothered him more than it should have. He reached for his phone, pretending to check emails while his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance near the kitchen hallway. Half of him still expected Clara to appear carrying a tray against one hip, apologizing softly for being late. She always moved quietly. Not shy. Not weak. Just calm in a way the city no longer understood. Ethan remembered the first night he'd noticed her nearly 2 years earlier. He'd walked into Maison Belmont after losing a $12 million hotel deal in Chicago. Furious. Exhausted. Ready to fire 3 executives before midnight. Clara had approached his table silently and asked, "Long night?" Not flirtatious. Not forced. Just human. Ethan had almost ignored her. But something about the steadiness in her pale blue eyes made him answer honestly. "You have no idea." 10 minutes later, she returned with black coffee and a slice of almond cake he hadn't ordered. "On the house," she'd said softly. "People make worse decisions when they're hungry." It was the first thing anyone had said to him in weeks that didn't sound rehearsed. After that, table 7 slowly became his ritual. Investors changed. Girlfriends changed. Entire companies rose and collapsed around him. But Clara remained. Quiet. Consistent. Like the soft piano music hidden beneath restaurant noise. Ethan rubbed a hand slowly across his jaw, trying to focus on the numbers glowing across his phone screen. But instead, memories surfaced in fragments. Clara placing a napkin beside his laptop before coffee spilled. Clara noticing his migraine before he spoke. Clara standing quietly near the window one snowy evening, watching the streetlights flicker across frozen sidewalks while jazz music played overhead. He realized suddenly, with unsettling clarity, that he knew almost nothing about her. No last name. No age. No story, just fragments. She liked old jazz records. She never wore jewelry except a silver watch with scratched edges. She smiled more with her eyes than her mouth. And somehow, despite sitting across from billionaires and celebrities every week, Ethan had never once asked who she really was. A folded receipt suddenly appeared beside his plate. "This was left for you," the young waitress said quietly before walking away. Ethan stared at the paper for a moment, then unfolded it slowly. It was an old coffee receipt, 2 years old maybe, slightly faded at the corners. On the back, written in small, elegant handwriting, was a single sentence. "You only noticed me when I disappeared." Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. Around him, the restaurant continued glowing with wealth and conversation. But Table 7 had never felt emptier. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole no longer wanted his coffee. Ethan stayed at Table 7 long after the restaurant began to empty. The espresso had gone cold nearly 20 minutes earlier, but he still had not touched it. Rain slid slowly down the tall windows beside him, turning the Manhattan lights outside into blurred streaks of gold and white. Somewhere near the bar, workers stacked wine glasses while soft jazz continued floating through the room like nothing had changed. But something had changed. He felt it now in every quiet corner of the restaurant, in the missing warmth beside the coffee cup, in the silence where Clara's calm voice used to be. Ethan folded the receipt carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat without fully understanding why. It was just paper, a faded piece of paper from years ago. Yet his chest felt strangely heavy as he stood to leave. "Mr. Cole," the young waitress called softly before he reached the exit. Ethan turned. Did Clara say where she was going? The girl hesitated. "No, sir. She just cleaned her station, turned in her apron, and left." "That is it." She smiled first. The answer unsettled him more than it should have. Outside, cold wind swept through Lexington Avenue as Ethan stepped beneath the restaurant awning. Black cars crawled through rain-slick streets while pedestrians hurried past holding umbrellas against the November storm. His driver quickly opened the back door of the town car, but Ethan remained still for a moment, staring through the restaurant window behind him. Table 7 sat empty now, clean, perfectly arranged, yet somehow lifeless. He could almost picture Clara there anyway, standing quietly beside the table with a coffee pot in one hand, watching him with those patient blue eyes that always seemed to notice more than she said aloud. Ethan slid into the car slowly. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. Ethan loosened his tie slightly. No, his voice sounded distant even to himself. "Drive around for a while." The car pulled away from the curb as rain tapped softly against the windows. Ethan leaned back against the leather seat, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. He tried focusing on tomorrow's investor meeting, on numbers, contracts, expansion plans in Miami. But instead, memories kept surfacing without permission. Clara laughing quietly when he once confused Beethoven with Mozart during dinner. Clara replacing a burnt-out candle at his table before he noticed the darkness. Clara standing outside the restaurant one snowy night feeding pieces of bread to pigeons while everyone else rushed past her. Tiny moments. Forgettable moments. Yet now they returned with painful clarity. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When had she become part of his life? He could not remember the exact moment anymore. She had simply always been there. Like rain against windows. Like jazz beneath conversation. Like the feeling of coming somewhere familiar after an impossible day. The realization unsettled him. Because Ethan Cole did not build emotional attachments. Especially not to people he barely knew. Yet somewhere between quarterly meetings and endless business dinners, Clara had quietly become the calmest part of his routine. The car stopped at a red light near Central Park. Ethan glanced absently toward the sidewalk outside and froze for half a second. A blonde woman stood beneath a street lamp across the avenue, wearing a long beige coat. His pulse jumped instantly before logic caught up. Not Clara, just someone with similar hair. Still, his chest tightened unexpectedly. The light turned green. Traffic moved again. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face slowly, irritated by his own reaction. This was ridiculous. People quit restaurants every day. Employees came and went constantly. Yet none of them had ever left behind this strange emptiness pressing quietly against his ribs. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from his assistant reminding him about tomorrow morning's conference call. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds before turning the phone off completely. Silence filled the car. Real silence. Not the expensive kind hidden beneath restaurant music and polished conversations. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that forced a man to hear his own thoughts clearly. 40 minutes later, Ethan finally arrived at his penthouse overlooking the East River. The elevator opened directly into cold marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city below. Usually the apartment impressed people. Tonight it just felt large and quiet. Too quiet. Ethan removed his coat slowly and paused when the folded receipt slipped from his pocket onto the kitchen counter. He stared at it again. "You only noticed me when I disappeared." The words felt different here. Sharper somehow. Ethan poured himself a glass of bourbon and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights glowed beneath low clouds while distant sirens echoed softly through the city. Somewhere out there, Clara was beginning a different life. And somehow that thought bothered him more than losing million-dollar deals ever had. He tried remembering their last real conversation. Not small talk. Not coffee orders. A real conversation. But all he found were fragments. "You should sleep more, Mr. Cole. The rain is supposed to freeze tonight. You always order whiskey when meetings go badly." Simple observations. Yet every sentence carried the strange feeling that she had been paying attention long before he ever did. Ethan sat down heavily beside the window and loosened his collar further. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. 3 nights earlier, Clara standing near table 7 while his investors laughed too loudly over expensive wine. One of them had asked if she worked there full-time. Ethan barely looked up from his phone when he answered. "She is always here." At the time, the sentence meant nothing. Now it echoed painfully inside his chest. She is always here. Not Clara. Not a person. Just part of the furniture in his world. Something dependable. Something permanent. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as regret settled quietly into the room around him. For the first time in years, the billionaire who controlled hotels across 3 continents finally understood something simple and deeply human. Some people do not leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they realized they were invisible the entire time. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath pale gray skies and freezing rain. Traffic crawled through the city in long silver lines while exhausted office workers hurried beneath umbrellas with coffee cups warming their hands. Ethan Cole usually loved mornings like this. Cold mornings felt efficient, sharp, predictable. But today, something fell off before he even stepped inside the boardroom on the 43rd floor of Cole International Hotels. "Good morning, sir," his assistant Lauren said carefully as she followed him through the glass hallway. "The investors from San Francisco are already waiting." Ethan nodded once without slowing down. His dark overcoat still carried traces of rainwater as he entered the conference room filled with polished wood, glowing screens, and men worth more money than entire countries. Normally, Ethan controlled rooms like this effortlessly. Calm voice. Perfect timing. Absolute focus. But today his attention kept drifting towards small, meaningless things. The coffee tasted wrong. Too bitter. Someone had adjusted the thermostat too low. The jazz playlist quietly playing through hidden speakers sounded strangely familiar. During the presentation, one of the investors asked a question about the new Chicago property acquisition. Ethan stared at the numbers on the screen for 2 full seconds before realizing he had not heard a single word. "Mr. Cole." Silence spread carefully around the table. Ethan blinked once and straightened slightly. "Repeat the question." Lauren glanced at him subtly from across the room. Concern flickered briefly across her face before disappearing behind professionalism. The meeting continued, but Ethan felt disconnected from every sentence leaving his mouth. By noon, he had approved contracts worth $70 million and remembered none of it. At exactly 1:17 in the afternoon, Ethan walked into his private office overlooking Midtown and immediately froze. A fresh espresso sat on his desk beside neatly organized reports. 2 sugar packets rested beside the cup. He stared at them for several seconds before pressing the intercom. "Lauren." "Yes, sir." "Who brought this coffee?" "I did." Ethan looked down again. 2 sugars. Wrong again. He closed his eyes briefly. "1 sugar," he said quietly. "You always take 1. Lauren sounded confused. Ethan almost answered immediately before realizing something unsettling. No. He did not always take 1. Some mornings he drank it black. Some nights, he preferred 2 sugars after difficult meetings. Clara had simply known which version of him would walk through the restaurant doors before he did. The realization settled heavily inside him. Lauren entered carefully, carrying a folder against her chest. Is everything all right? Ethan looked out the windows instead of answering. 43 floors below, yellow taxis moved through wet streets like tiny reflections beneath gray clouds. Lauren, he said slowly, did I ever mention a waitress named Clara to you? She blinked slightly, surprised by the question. The woman from Maison Belmont? Ethan turned toward her. You know her? Not personally, but you have gone there almost every night for 2 years. Lauren hesitated politely. Everyone in your schedule knew who Clara was. Ethan stared at her silently. Somehow that made things worse. Everyone else had noticed Clara mattered before he did. Lauren carefully placed the corrected espresso on his desk. 1 sugar this time. She seemed nice, she added gently before leaving the office. Nice. The word irritated him immediately. Clara was not nice. Nice was forgettable. Temporary. Clara had been grounding, like the steady sound of rain against windows during chaos. Ethan sat down slowly and opened his laptop, intending to focus on work. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the folded receipt resting beside his keyboard. He had carried it with him all morning without fully understanding why. You only noticed me when I disappeared. The sentence no longer felt dramatic. It felt accurate. Painfully accurate. Ethan leaned back heavily and suddenly remembered another night months earlier. He had arrived at Maison Belmont furious after losing an acquisition deal in Boston. Clara had approached quietly with his espresso already prepared. Bad day? She asked softly. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. I lost something important. Clara had looked at him for a moment before answering. Sometimes people only realize what matters after it is gone. At the time, Ethan barely listened. He was too distracted checking emails while talking to investors. But now the memory returned with unbearable clarity. She had been telling him goodbye long before she left. The realization tightened something deep inside his chest. Ethan stood abruptly and grabbed his coat. 20 minutes later, he walked back into Maison Belmont for the second time in less than 24 hours. Afternoon light filtered softly through the tall restaurant windows while workers prepared tables for evening service. Without the crowded dinner atmosphere, the restaurant looked strangely smaller. Quieter. Human. The manager, Victor Moreau, looked surprised when Ethan approached him directly. Mr. Cole, you are here early. Ethan skipped formalities. I need Clara's last name. Victor's expression changed carefully. I do not think that would be appropriate. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Victor. No disrespect, sir. But Clara was very clear. Ethan stared at him. Clear about what? Victor hesitated before answering quietly. That if you ever came asking questions after she left, we should let her go peacefully. For several seconds Ethan said nothing at all. Somewhere in the kitchen, plates clinked softly while muted jazz drifted through the empty dining room. Let her go peacefully. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Peacefully. As if Clara had already accepted something Ethan still refused to understand. Victor studied him carefully before reaching beneath the front desk. She did leave one thing behind, he admitted quietly. Ethan looked up instantly. Victor handed him a small worn notebook with faded blue covers. Ethan recognized it immediately. Clara used to write in it during slow evenings near the window. She forgot this? Ethan asked. Victor gave a sad smile. No, sir. He paused gently. I think she wanted you to finally read it. Ethan did not open the notebook until after midnight. Rain still drifted softly across the city outside his penthouse windows, while distant thunder rolled somewhere above the East River. The apartment remained silent except for the faint ticking of the antique clock near the fireplace. Usually Ethan enjoyed silence. Tonight it felt heavy, personal. He loosened his tie and sat beside the kitchen counter with the worn blue notebook resting in front of him like something fragile. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Clara had touched this notebook almost every night. He remembered seeing her write in it beside the restaurant window during quiet hours. Sometimes she smiled faintly afterward. Sometimes she looked sad. Ethan never asked what she wrote because he never imagined the pages had anything to do with him. Slowly, he opened the cover. The first page contained no diary entries. No dramatic confessions. Just neat handwriting beside random dates. November 3rd, Mr. Cole skipped dinner again. Headache. Ethan frowned slightly. The next page. November 11th. He pretended the meeting did not bother him. Ordered whiskey instead of wine. Tired eyes tonight. Ethan swallowed quietly. Another page. December 2nd. Snowstorm outside. He gave his coat to the elderly man near the corner when he thought nobody was watching. Ethan leaned back slowly. The notebook was not a journal. It was observations. Tiny moments. Pieces of him collected quietly over 2 years by someone he barely noticed enough to ask simple questions. He kept turning pages. January 14th. He laughs differently when he forgets he is important. February 9th. Mr. Cole always checks his phone when he is lonely. March 17th. He looks happiest during the jazz songs from the old records. Ethan stared at the sentence for a long moment. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Clara had been paying attention to him in ways nobody else ever had. Not because of his money, not because of his influence, but because she genuinely saw him beneath all of it. He closed the notebook briefly and rubbed a hand across his face. Somewhere deep inside him, guilt began spreading quietly. Not sharp guilt. Worse, the slow kind. The kind built from realizing someone gave you kindness for years while you offered almost nothing back. Ethan stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights flickered beneath low clouds while rain painted silver lines across the glass. Somewhere out there, Clara had walked away carrying memories he never realized he was creating with her. He opened the notebook again. Halfway through, a folded photograph slipped gently onto the floor. Ethan picked it up carefully. Clara sat beside an older woman wrapped in a pale blue blanket near what looked like a hospital room window. The older woman smiled weakly while Clara leaned her head softly against her shoulder. Ethan stared at the image. Clara looked different there. Softer. Exhausted. Human in a way he had never bothered imagining before. On the back of the photograph, written faintly in pencil, were 4 words. Mom remembered my name today. Ethan felt something shift painfully inside his chest. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. The exhaustion behind Clara's eyes some nights. The second job she once vaguely mentioned. The way she occasionally disappeared for days and returned acting like nothing happened. She had been carrying an entire life outside that restaurant while Ethan only noticed whether his coffee arrived on time. He sat down heavily and turned another page. Near the back of the notebook, the handwriting changed slightly. More emotional somehow. Less careful. I think the hardest part about people like Ethan Cole is that they do not mean to hurt anyone. Ethan froze completely. His eyes moved slowly across the page. They are simply too used to being needed. Too used to believing everyone will stay. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Ethan could hear his own breathing now. Tonight he introduced me as the waitress again. I smiled because I knew he did not understand why that hurt. Ethan lowered the notebook slowly onto the counter. The memory returned immediately. The investor dinner. 3 nights earlier. Clara standing beside the table while wealthy executives laughed over expensive bourbon. Someone had complimented her intelligence after overhearing her discussing jazz music with another customer. Ethan barely looked up before saying casually, "She is just the waitress here." At the time, the sentence felt harmless, normal, efficient, but now he remembered something else. Clara's silence afterward. The way her smile faded almost invisibly before she walked away carrying empty glasses against her chest. Ethan closed his eyes tightly. For the first time, he saw the moment clearly. Not from his perspective, from hers. A woman who quietly cared for someone over years. Remembered his routines. Understood his moods. Listened when nobody else did. Reduced to a title in front of strangers by the one person she hoped finally saw her as more. Ethan exhaled slowly, guilt pressing deeper into his ribs. The final pages of the notebook contained fewer entries. Shorter sentences. As if Clara had already started letting go emotionally before she physically left. People do not break all at once. Sometimes they simply become tired. Ethan turned the page carefully. I do not think Ethan is cruel. Another page. I think he is lonely in ways expensive things cannot fix. Ethan stared downward silently, then finally reached the last page. Unlike the others, this page contained only one sentence written across the center in slightly trembling handwriting. The saddest thing about being invisible is eventually realizing you stayed too long hoping someone would finally look at you differently. The city lights blurred faintly beyond the windows as Ethan lowered the notebook into his lap. Somewhere between the rain, the silence, and Clara's quiet words, the billionaire who spent his entire life controlling outcomes finally understood something devastatingly simple. Clara had not left because she stopped caring about him. She left because caring had started hurting too much. For the next 3 days, Ethan Cole stopped sleeping properly. Manhattan moved around him at its usual impossible speed, while billion-dollar meetings filled his calendar from sunrise until late evening, but none of it held his attention anymore. His executives noticed first. He forgot names during presentations, signed documents without reading them twice, left conference calls halfway through because his thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely, toward a quiet blonde waitress who no longer existed inside his carefully structured world. On Thursday night, Ethan found himself standing outside Maison Belmont again beneath freezing rain. He had not planned to come. His driver simply turned onto Lexington Avenue automatically out of habit, and Ethan never corrected him. The restaurant glowed warmly behind tall windows, while couples laughed beneath golden chandeliers inside. Life continuing normally, as if Clara had never existed there at all. Ethan remained motionless beneath the awning for several seconds before walking inside. Victor looked up immediately from behind the front desk. Something sad flickered across his expression. "Good evening, Mr. Cole." Ethan nodded once. "Table 7 available." "Always." The answer landed strangely. Ethan sat down slowly while soft piano jazz drifted through the dining room. A different waitress approached carefully with menus, but Ethan barely glanced at them. Everything felt unfamiliar now. The lighting, the music, even the scent of coffee in the air. It amazed him how one person could disappear and somehow alter the emotional temperature of an entire room. "Your usual espresso?" the waitress asked politely. Ethan looked toward the empty chair across from him instead of answering. No, his voice sounded tired. "Just water." The waitress left quietly. Ethan rested his elbows against the table and stared absent-mindedly toward the rain beyond the windows. Across the room, another customer laughed loudly while checking his phone every few seconds. For some reason, the sight reminded Ethan painfully of himself. He suddenly remembered Clara once saying softly, "People who constantly look at their phones are usually waiting for something they cannot explain." At the time, he laughed without understanding what she meant. Now he understood too well. Ethan pulled the blue notebook from inside his coat again. He had carried it everywhere for days. During flights, meetings, even investor dinners. Not because he enjoyed punishing himself, but because it felt like the only honest thing anyone had ever written about him. He opened randomly to the middle pages. Tonight, Mr. Cole looked exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. Ethan swallowed hard. Another entry beneath it. "I wonder if anyone asks him how he is when cameras are not around." Ethan stared at the words for a long moment before quietly closing the notebook again. Nobody did ask him that. Not really. His entire life had become transactions disguised as relationships. Investors needed confidence. Partners needed strategy. Women he dated usually needed status or proximity to power. Everyone wanted something from Ethan Cole. Except Clara. She had simply wanted to be seen. The realization hollowed him out from the inside. "You look terrible." Ethan glanced up sharply. His younger sister Olivia stood beside the table removing rain gloves from her hands. Blonde like their mother. Elegant without trying. The only person in Ethan's life who still spoke to him honestly. "Lauren called me," Olivia said as she sat down across from him. "Apparently you have spent 3 days acting like someone died." Ethan gave a dry laugh. "Dramatic." Olivia studied him carefully. "Is it the waitress?" Ethan looked away immediately, which answered the question for her. Olivia exhaled softly. "Wow. What? You really cared about her?" Ethan stared at the water glass in front of him. "I do not know." Olivia leaned back quietly. "That usually means yes." Silence settled between them while jazz music floated gently through the restaurant. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "She quit." Olivia nodded once. "Lauren mentioned that too." Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. "I think I heard her." Olivia's expression softened slightly. "Did you?" Ethan remembered the investor dinner. Clara's fading smile. The notebook pages filled with quiet disappointment. Not intentionally. Olivia gave him a sad smile. "Ethan, the worst kind of pain usually is not intentional." Her words lingered heavily between them. Ethan looked around the restaurant slowly. "I barely knew anything about her. Yet here you are." He laughed bitterly beneath his breath. "She remembered everything about me." Olivia watched him silently for a moment before asking softly, "Did you ever ask about her life?" Ethan did not answer, because he already knew the truth. "No." He had not asked enough. Not because he did not care, but because somewhere along the way, he unconsciously assumed Clara would always remain part of his world no matter how little emotional effort he offered in return. Olivia reached across the table and gently touched the blue notebook resting beside his hand. People like her are rare, Ethan. What do you mean? The quiet ones. Olivia glanced toward the rain-covered windows. The ones who notice things. The ones who care without needing attention for it. Ethan lowered his eyes slowly. Clara had done that constantly. Tiny acts of care hidden so naturally inside everyday moments that he stopped noticing them altogether. Olivia stood a few minutes later and placed cash beside her untouched coffee. Before leaving, she paused near Ethan's shoulder. If you find her, she said quietly, do not start by telling her how much you miss her. Ethan looked up slightly. Then what? Olivia smiled sadly. Start by asking who she really is. Then she disappeared into the Manhattan rain, leaving Ethan alone again at table 7 beneath soft golden light. He sat there for nearly another hour listening to jazz piano and watching strangers move through the restaurant Clara once filled with warmth. Finally, as midnight approached, Victor quietly approached the table carrying a small cardboard box. This arrived yesterday, he said gently. Ethan frowned. For me? Victor nodded once. Clara left instructions to give it to you if you kept coming back. Ethan stared at the box silently. Small, plain, sealed carefully with tape. Suddenly his pulse quickened for reasons he could not explain. Slowly, he reached for it. Ethan carried the small cardboard box home like it contained something fragile enough to break under the weight of his thoughts. Manhattan had gone quiet beneath freezing midnight rain, while traffic lights reflected red and gold across wet pavement outside the car windows. His driver occasionally glanced into the rearview mirror, noticing the unusual silence from the billionaires seated in the back. Usually Ethan spent rides answering emails or negotiating deals through late-night calls. Tonight, he simply stared at the unopened box resting on his lap. By the time he entered the penthouse, the city skyline had disappeared behind heavy fog rolling across the East River. Ethan loosened his coat slowly and placed the box on the kitchen counter beneath soft overhead lights. For several moments, he only stood there looking at it. Clara had prepared this before leaving, which meant she expected him to come back to the restaurant. Expected him to ask questions too late. That realization alone hurt more than he wanted to admit. Slowly, Ethan opened the box. Inside rested 3 things. A vinyl jazz record, a folded cream-colored letter, and a small silver key attached to a faded blue tag with handwritten numbers. Apartment 4B. Ethan stared at the key first. Simple, worn from years of use. Somehow more personal than anything else inside the box. Then he carefully unfolded the letter. Clara's handwriting appeared immediately. Soft, elegant, calm even on paper. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then it means you finally stopped rushing long enough to notice silence. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the counter while rain whispered against the windows around him. I used to think people changed dramatically, loudly, but now I think most people simply become tired quietly. His chest tightened immediately. I did not leave because of one sentence or one bad night. I left because somewhere along the way, I started disappearing inside your world. Ethan swallowed hard and kept reading. You never yelled at me. Never treated me cruelly. Honestly, that would have been easier. The difficult part was realizing you could look directly at me every night and still never truly ask who I was. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every word felt painfully earned. I think part of you cared about me. I really do. But caring quietly is dangerous when it is never spoken aloud. Rain tapped harder against the glass now, filling the apartment with soft rhythmic sound. Ethan continued reading slowly. The jazz record belonged to my father. He used to play it every Sunday morning while making pancakes badly and pretending he could dance. A faint smile almost touched Ethan's face before disappearing again. After he passed away, my mother stopped listening to music altogether. Sometimes grief does not arrive loudly either. Ethan glanced toward the vinyl resting beside the letter. Worn edges. Old blue cover faded by time. Clara had trusted him with something deeply personal. That realization settled heavily inside him. The key belongs to the apartment where I stayed while taking care of my mother during her treatments. I already moved out, so do not panic. I am not inviting you there. Ethan exhaled softly despite himself. Even now, Her humor remained gentle. There is something inside I think you deserve to see. Not because you owe me anything, but because maybe understanding someone requires seeing the parts of their life they carried quietly. Ethan's pulse slowed strangely as he reached the final lines. You once told me successful people survive by never needing anyone too much. I used to admire that about you. Now I think it might actually be the saddest thing I have ever heard. Ethan lowered the letter slowly onto the counter. Silence swallowed the room completely afterward. He looked toward the apartment key again. Apartment 4B. Somewhere in Manhattan. Somewhere Clara once returned to after serving wealthy strangers all evening beneath restaurant chandeliers. Suddenly, Ethan realized something painful. He had never once wondered where Clara went after work. Whether she ate dinner. Whether she slept enough. Whether she had someone waiting for her at home after long nights caring for everyone except herself. Because in his mind, she had existed only inside Maison Belmont. Only inside the parts of life convenient for him to see. The realization hollowed him out quietly. 30 minutes later, Ethan stood outside an old brick apartment building on the Upper West Side, while freezing wind swept down empty streets around him. The neighborhood felt different from his world. Smaller coffee shops, narrow sidewalks, warm yellow lights glowing behind old apartment windows. Human. Real. Ethan climbed 4 flights of stairs carrying the silver key tightly in one hand. Apartment 4B waited silently at the end of a narrow hallway. He hesitated before unlocking the door. The apartment smelled faintly of old books and lavender. Small. Simple. Warm in ways his penthouse never managed to feel. Ethan stepped inside slowly. A piano stood near the living room window beside stacks of sheet music and worn novels. Photographs covered one wall. Clara as a teenager beside an older woman. Clara wearing a graduation robe. Clara sitting at the piano smiling openly in ways Ethan had never seen before. His eyes moved slowly around the apartment. There were medical bills stacked carefully beside the kitchen counter. Prescription receipts. Handwritten grocery lists. A calendar covered with doctor appointments and late-night work shifts. Clara's entire life quietly laid bare inside a tiny apartment no larger than one of his guest bedrooms. Ethan walked toward the piano slowly. Resting above the keys was another note written in Clara's handwriting. Only one sentence this time. You spent years believing I needed saving because I worked as a waitress. Ethan stared at the words while the city lights flickered softly beyond the apartment window. Then his eyes drifted lower toward the piano bench where framed beneath glass rested a diploma from Juilliard School of Music. Ethan froze completely. For several seconds, he could only stare silently at Clara Bennett's name written across the elegant paper beneath the school seal. The quiet waitress he barely noticed had once belonged to one of the most prestigious music schools in America. And somehow, despite sitting across from her nearly every night for 2 years, Ethan Cole had never once asked what dreams she gave up before he met her. Ethan remained inside Clara's apartment long after midnight disappeared from the city clocks. The old piano stood quietly near the window while soft streetlight reflections stretched across its polished black surface. Rain had finally stopped outside, leaving Manhattan wrapped in cold silver silence. Ethan slowly walked through the apartment again, this time seeing everything differently. Not as objects, but as evidence of a life lived with quiet sacrifice. On the kitchen counter sat unopened envelopes, marked final notice beside carefully folded grocery coupons. A small whiteboard near the refrigerator listed medication schedules in neat handwriting. Mom breakfast pills, 8 a.m. Physical therapy, Tuesday. Do not forget piano practice, even if tired. Ethan stared at the last sentence longer than the others. Even while carrying hospital bills and double shifts at the restaurant, Clara had still reminded herself not to abandon music completely. Something about that broke his heart more than anything else. He moved toward the bookshelf near the piano. Most of the shelves contained music theory books, jazz biographies, and worn classical scores filled with handwritten notes. But one framed newspaper clipping near the bottom caught his attention immediately. Juilliard rising star Clara Bennett performs at Carnegie Hall. Ethan picked it up carefully. The article showed a younger Clara seated at a grand piano beneath stage lights. Confident, elegant, alive in ways he had never witnessed inside Maison Belmont. He read slowly. At only 23 years old, Clara Bennett has already become one of the most promising young classical pianists in New York. Ethan lowered the article slightly, stunned. 23. Around the same age she would have been when she first started working at the restaurant. His chest tightened painfully as realization settled in deeper. Clara had not simply sacrificed convenience. She had sacrificed an entire future. And somehow, during all those nights serving wealthy strangers expensive wine, she carried that loss quietly enough that nobody noticed. Ethan sat slowly at the piano bench. His fingers brushed lightly across the ivory keys. One note echoed softly through the apartment. Then another. Simple, gentle. Somewhere beneath the music stand, he noticed a folded stack of papers tied carefully with faded ribbon. He hesitated before opening them. Medical records, hospital statements, insurance denials, thousands of dollars in treatments for Clara's mother stretching across several exhausting years. Ethan exhaled slowly. So this was where the money went. The double shifts, the exhaustion in her eyes. The nights she looked too tired to stand, yet still remembered exactly how he preferred his coffee after difficult meetings. His gaze drifted toward the framed photograph near the piano again. Clara smiling beside her mother in the hospital room. For the first time, Ethan realized something devastatingly simple. While he spent years building luxury hotels across the world, Clara had been quietly fighting to keep one person alive. And she did it without bitterness, without asking anyone to rescue her. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Shame settled heavily across his shoulders now. Not because he failed to save Clara, but because he never even noticed she was drowning. His phone suddenly buzzed loudly in the silence. Lauren. Ethan almost ignored it before answering quietly. What? Sir, I am sorry to call this late. Her voice sounded hesitant. But the Tokyo investors moved the meeting to tomorrow morning. Ethan stared absently at the piano keys. Cancel it. Silence. Sir, cancel all meetings tomorrow. Lauren sounded genuinely shocked. You have not taken a day off in almost 3 years. Ethan looked slowly around Clara's tiny apartment again. I know. After hanging up, he remained seated at the piano while cold dawn slowly began lightening the city beyond the windows. For years, Ethan Cole measured success through expansion charts and acquisition numbers. But inside this small apartment, surrounded by overdue medical bills and forgotten music scores, all of it suddenly felt embarrassingly empty. His eyes drifted toward another notebook resting beside the piano bench. Smaller than the blue one, more worn. He opened it carefully. Unlike the first notebook, these pages contained music compositions, handwritten piano arrangements filled with delicate notes and emotional markings. Most titles were simple. Winter Rain, Sunday Morning, Mother Sleeping. Then Ethan reached the final unfinished piece. The title alone stopped his breathing for a moment. Table 7. Slowly, he turned the pages. Notes stretched across the paper like conversations left incomplete. Quiet melodies rising and fading softly. Lonely in places, hopeful in others. Ethan did not understand music technically, but somehow he understood this. Clara had turned emotions into sound because nobody around her ever asked her to speak them aloud. He reached the final page and froze again. At the bottom corner, written in tiny handwriting beneath the unfinished composition, were 6 words. Some people never hear themselves breaking. Ethan lowered the notebook slowly. The sunrise outside painted pale gold across the apartment walls while the city awakened beneath him. Somewhere nearby, a coffee shop opened for early customers. A siren echoed faintly several blocks away. Life moving forward. But Ethan felt suspended between 2 versions of himself. The man who walked into Maison Belmont every night expecting comfort without effort. And the man now sitting alone inside the quiet remains of someone else's sacrifice. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed against the apartment door. Ethan stood immediately, startled. Another knock followed. He crossed the apartment slowly before opening the door. An elderly woman stood in the hallway holding grocery bags against her coat. White hair. Kind tired eyes. She blinked in surprise upon seeing him. Oh. Her voice softened with confusion. You are not Clara. Ethan straightened slightly. No, ma'am. The woman studied him carefully for a moment before her expression shifted gently. You are the man from the restaurant. Ethan froze completely. Clara talked about me? The older woman smiled sadly. Only every day. Ethan stood motionless in the apartment doorway while the elderly woman adjusted the grocery bags against her coat with trembling fingers. Morning light spilled softly through the hallway windows behind her. turning strands of silver hair almost gold. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the woman smiled gently. You should probably let me inside before Mrs. Patterson from downstairs starts inventing stories. Ethan stepped aside immediately. Of course. The woman entered slowly, her movements careful but familiar inside the small apartment. She placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter before glancing toward the piano with quiet affection. She kept it polished even when she was exhausted. Ethan closed the apartment door softly behind them. You are Clara's mother? The woman nodded once. Margaret Bennett. She studied him calmly. And you are Ethan Cole. Hearing his full name inside Clara's apartment felt strangely uncomfortable now. Too formal. Too distant from the version of himself reflected inside her notebooks. Margaret removed her gloves slowly while Ethan remained awkwardly near the doorway. Finally, she smiled faintly. You look exactly how Clara described you. Ethan frowned slightly. How did she describe me? Margaret gave a quiet laugh beneath her breath. Tall. Tired. Lonely eyes. Expensive watches. Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. That sounds accurate. Margaret's expression softened. She always noticed details. Ethan looked toward the piano again. I'm starting to realize that. Silence settled gently between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Margaret unpacked groceries carefully while Ethan stood nearby, unsure whether he should stay or leave. Finally, she spoke again without looking up. You hurt her, you know. The sentence arrived softly, calmly, which somehow made it hurt more. Ethan lowered his eyes. I know. Margaret nodded once as if she respected the honesty. Most people who hurt Clara did not even realize they were doing it. Ethan looked up slowly. Did she tell you everything? Margaret smiled sadly. Mothers usually know before daughters do. Ethan leaned lightly against the counter. She never said anything to me. That was Clara's problem. Margaret placed a carton of milk carefully into the refrigerator. She loved quietly. The words settled heavily inside Ethan's chest. Loved. Not admired. Not cared about. Loved. He stared silently toward the rain-streaked windows while his pulse slowed strangely. Part of him had known already. Somewhere beneath the jazz music and late-night coffees and notebook pages, he had known. But hearing it spoken aloud changed something inside him permanently. Margaret continued softly. She would come home after work and talk about you while making tea. Ethan looked back toward her immediately. What did she say? The older woman smiled faintly while folding grocery bags neatly beside the sink. Mostly little things. Her voice grew distant with memory. How you pretended not to care about birthdays, but always tipped musicians extra during holiday weeks. How you looked out the restaurant windows whenever it rained. How your voice changed when speaking to children. Ethan swallowed quietly. Clara had been collecting pieces of him long before he ever thought to ask about her favorite color. Margaret's expression softened further. She understood you in ways that frightened her sometimes. Ethan stared downward. I did not deserve that. No, Margaret agreed gently. But she gave it anyway. Silence returned. Outside, the city slowly awakened beneath pale winter light, while somewhere below, car horns echoed faintly through Manhattan streets. Ethan glanced toward the framed Juilliard diploma again. Why did she leave music? Margaret followed his gaze toward the piano. For a moment her eyes filled with quiet sadness. Because life became expensive. She moved slowly toward the piano bench and rested one hand gently across its polished surface. When my treatment started, Clara was performing 3 nights a week downtown while attending graduate classes during the day. Ethan listened silently. She never complained. Margaret continued softly. Not once. She simply picked up more shifts. Sold concert dresses. Canceled auditions. Her fingers traced the edge of the piano. Eventually, she stopped introducing herself as a musician altogether. Ethan felt guilt spread deeper inside him. He remembered introducing Clara as just the waitress, while she carried an entire unfinished symphony of sacrifice behind her smile. Margaret sat carefully on the piano bench. Do you know what hurt her most? Ethan looked at her quietly. Not that you overlooked her. She understood your world. Margaret smiled sadly. It was that she hoped one day you would finally ask her to stay after the restaurant closed. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. Stay. Not romantically. Margaret shook her head gently. Just stay? Talk. Ask questions. See her outside the uniform. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. How many opportunities had he ignored without realizing? How many nights had Clara stood near table 7 hoping for something simple and human while he buried himself inside emails and business calls? Margaret studied him carefully now. You loved her too. Ethan opened his eyes immediately. I do not know if I deserve to call it that. Love is not always loud, Ethan. Her voice remained calm. Sometimes it hides inside routines until the routine disappears. The apartment fell silent again. Ethan slowly walked toward the piano and noticed sheet music spread across the stand. Clara's unfinished composition. Table 7. Margaret noticed his attention immediately. She wrote that after meeting you. Ethan stared at the notes quietly. Did she ever play it for anyone? Margaret shook her head. No. She said it was incomplete because the person it belonged to never really listened. Ethan lowered his eyes slowly. The sentence landed like quiet heartbreak. Margaret stood carefully and moved toward the coat rack near the door. She left New York yesterday morning. Ethan looked up instantly. You know where she went? Margaret hesitated. For a brief moment, Ethan thought she might refuse. But then her tired eyes softened. Chicago. His pulse quickened immediately. Margaret continued gently. There is a small historic hotel near Lake Michigan called the Alderwick. She smiled faintly. Apparently, they needed a pianist for winter season performances. Ethan stared at her silently. Clara was playing again. Somewhere beyond New York and expensive restaurants and invisible heartbreak, Clara had returned to music. Margaret slipped her coat back on slowly. Before leaving, she turned toward Ethan one final time. If you go after her, she said quietly, do not arrive carrying guilt. Ethan frowned slightly. Then what should I bring? Margaret smiled with the kind sadness only mothers understand. Curiosity. She waited a very long time for someone to finally ask who she really was. Chicago greeted Ethan Cole with freezing wind and pale winter sunlight reflecting across Lake Michigan like broken silver. The city felt quieter than Manhattan. Slower somehow. Less interested in pretending exhaustion was success. Ethan stepped from the Blacktown car, wearing the same charcoal overcoat he always traveled in. Yet everything about him felt different now. The driver offered to carry his luggage, but Ethan shook his head gently. I will manage. The word surprised even him. The Alderwick Hotel stood near the waterfront wrapped in old-world elegance and soft golden lights glowing behind tall windows. Unlike the polished luxury towers Ethan usually owned, this place felt intimate. Human. A piano melody drifted faintly through the lobby before he even stepped inside. Ethan froze instantly. Clara. His pulse tightened hard against his ribs as he entered slowly beneath crystal chandeliers and warm amber light. Guests sat quietly near the fireplace while snow drifted softly outside the tall windows overlooking the frozen lake. And there she was. Clara Bennett sat behind a black grand piano wearing a dark emerald dress beneath soft evening light. Her blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders now instead of tied neatly behind restaurant uniforms. Her eyes remained lowered toward the piano keys, while music flowed through the room with quiet elegance. Ethan stood completely still. For several seconds, he forgot how to breathe properly, because this was the first time he had ever truly seen her in her own world. Not carrying trays, not memorizing everyone else's needs. Just Clara, whole, radiant, alive inside music. The melody filled every corner of the hotel lounge softly enough that conversations faded around it naturally. Ethan watched her fingers move across ivory keys with graceful confidence, while snowflakes drifted outside behind her like pieces of silence falling from the sky. She looked peaceful. That realization both relieved and destroyed him at the same time. Clara had learned how to exist beautifully without him. Ethan slowly removed his gloves, but did not move closer. He simply stood near the entrance listening while emotions he could no longer organize settled heavily inside his chest. Suddenly, he remembered the unfinished composition in her apartment. Table 7. The loneliness hidden between the notes. The hope. The waiting. And for the first time, Ethan understood why the piece remained unfinished. Because Clara had spent years playing emotional music for someone too distracted to hear it. The final note faded softly through the lounge. Guests applauded gently. Clara smiled politely while standing from the piano bench. Then her eyes lifted toward the lobby entrance. Toward him. For one suspended moment, neither moved. Ethan saw surprise flicker across her face first. Then caution. Then something quieter he could not name. Clara walked toward him slowly after excusing herself from the piano. Up close, she looked both familiar and entirely different. Stronger somehow. Less tired. Chicago is a long way from Manhattan, she said softly. Ethan almost smiled at the understatement. Apparently not long enough. Clara looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. How did you find me? Your mother. Something warm flickered across her expression immediately. She likes you more than I expected. Ethan exhaled softly. I think she mostly pitied me. Clara laughed quietly beneath her breath. The sound hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had missed that laugh more than anything. Silence settled gently between them while snow continued drifting outside the hotel windows. Finally, Ethan spoke again. You are playing professionally again. Clara glanced toward the piano. Part-time. You should be playing Carnegie Hall. She looked back at him carefully. You read the article. Ethan nodded once. I read everything. Clara studied him silently for several seconds. That is dangerous. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. I know. The honesty in his voice softened something in her expression. Around them, guests continued sipping wine beside the fireplace while jazz floated quietly from hidden speakers. But Ethan barely noticed any of it. Because for the first time since meeting Clara, he was standing in front of her without distraction. No phone in his hand. No investor waiting nearby. No emotional distance protecting him from honesty. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Clara shook her head gently. Ethan, no, his voice remained calm but firm. You spent 2 years seeing me clearly while I barely asked who you were. Clara looked away toward the falling snow outside. You were busy. Ethan almost laughed bitterly. That is not an excuse anymore. Silence again. Soft. Careful. Finally, Clara spoke quietly. Do you know what hurt the most? Ethan looked at her immediately. What? Her blue eyes held his steadily now. Not being invisible to the world. She swallowed softly. Being invisible to someone I thought noticed everything. The words landed gently, which somehow made them devastating. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before answering honestly. I noticed you. Clara smiled sadly. Not really. He could not argue with her. Because she was right. He noticed her beauty, her calmness, her kindness toward him. But he never noticed the full weight of her sacrifices until absence forced him to look deeper. Ethan glanced toward the piano again. I listened to your composition. Clara froze slightly. You found that? Yes. He hesitated. It deserved to be finished. Her expression softened unexpectedly. Maybe. Snow continued falling quietly beyond the windows while the hotel lights reflected warmly against polished floors around them. Ethan finally reached into his coat pocket and removed the faded coffee receipt she left behind weeks earlier. He unfolded it carefully between them. You wrote that I only noticed you after you disappeared. Clara looked at the paper silently. Ethan's voice lowered. I think you were right. Something vulnerable flickered across her face then. Not triumph. Not anger. Just sadness mixed with understanding. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before asking the question he should have asked years earlier. Clara, his voice softened. Who are you when nobody needs anything from you? For the first time since he arrived in Chicago, Clara's eyes filled gently with emotion. Not because he chased her across cities. Not because he regretted losing her. But because after all this time, Ethan Cole had finally asked the one question she waited years to hear.